True love chooses no face or name. He simply recognizes the soul he has always sought. The wagon swayed over the dusty road leading to Cedar Valley, and Margaret felt every jolt like a blow to her conscience. Her hands trembled as she clutched the yellowed letter that was not intended for her, but for her younger sister, Elizabeth. The words of Thomas Bennet, the farmer looking for a wife, had been written for someone else, but fate had put those papers in his hands when Elizabeth fled the early morning before the arranged marriage. The midday sun punished the parched land, creating heat waves that distorted the landscape ahead. Margaret adjusted the straw hat that had belonged to her sister and looked at the distant mountains that hugged the valley. By the age of 26, she had accepted that marriage was not part of her future. He had cared for his sick mother for years, while Elizabeth flourished as the favorite daughter, beautiful and carefree. Now, wearing the light blue dress Elizabeth had chosen to impress her future husband, Margaret felt like an imposter wearing someone else's dreams. The coachman pointed to an estate that stretched across the plain. The main house stood modestly but solid, surrounded by corrals where horses grazed peacefully. Fields of golden wheat rippled gently in the breeze, and in the distance a few cattle sought shade under lonely oak trees. It was a place that breathed honest work and hope planted in the land. Margaret felt her heart racing when she saw a tall man coming out of the barn. Even from a distance, she could see the way he moved with purpose, each firm step on the earth he knew like the back of his hand. Thomas Bennet wiped his hands on a cloth before walking toward the oncoming wagon, and Margaret noticed how he straightened his shoulders, preparing to meet the woman he believed he had chosen through letters exchanged over months. The coachman pulled the reins, and the wagon came to a halt with a gentle creaking of the wheels on the gravel. Margaret took a deep breath, knowing that in the next few moments her life would take a completely new turn. She had made the decision to come in Elizabeth's place, not only to save the family's reputation, but because something in Thomas's letters had touched a part of her soul that she thought was dormant forever. Thomas approached with cautious steps, and when her eyes met Margaret's, she saw something that caught her off guard. It was no disappointment or surprise that she was not exactly as Elizabeth had described herself in the letters. It was recognition. As if, in some mysterious way, he was seeing exactly who he expected to find. He reached out to help her down from the cart, and Margaret felt the gentle force of his fingers around hers. Thomas had honey-colored eyes that seemed to hold stories of lonely nights under the stars and mornings working before dawn. There was a natural goodness on her face, tempered by the wisdom of one who had learned that life in the West offered no guarantees, only opportunities for those brave enough to embrace them. The breeze carried the aroma of freshly cut hay and the promise of rain in the clouds that formed on the horizon. Margaret knew she had to explain, she had to tell the truth about who she really was and why she was there in her sister's place. But when Thomas smiled, a smile that reached her eyes and seemed to light up her entire face, she felt that perhaps fate had other plans. Thomas held his suitcase carefully and gestured toward the house. There was no rush in his movements, no anxiety or expectation weighing on his shoulders. It was as if he intuitively understood that some moments in life need to be lived slowly, savored like the first sip of fresh water after a long day under the scorching sun. Margaret walked beside him along the path that led to the porch, watching as his boots kicked up small clouds of golden dust. The house was exactly as Thomas had described in his letters, simple yet welcoming, with large windows that captured all the available light and a balcony that invited quiet nights of stargazing. It was the kind of place where a person could build a real life, away from the complications and pretensions of the city. When they reached the porch, Thomas stopped and turned to her. For a moment, they studied each other in silence like two travelers who found themselves at the same crossroads and had to decide which path to take together. Margaret saw in his eyes the same cautious hope that she felt growing in her own heart, and she knew that no matter how she got there, this was exactly where she was supposed to be. Thomas Bennett's house held the essence of a man who had learned to find beauty in simple things. The light wood walls reflected the soft afternoon light, and solid, handmade furniture filled the space with the dignity of objects created to last generations. Margaret watched every detail as Thomas brewed tea in the kitchen, his movements revealing years of solitary life arranged with meticulous care. An oak table dominated the main room, polished by constant use and marked by small scars that told stories of solitary meals and nights planning the future of the estate. On the sideboard, framed photographs showed an older couple, probably Thomas's parents, and a few men standing next to horses, all with the same gentle smile she had seen on the farmer's face. Margaret sat down in the chair Thomas had appointed and felt the weight of the decision she had made. Elizabeth's letters were tucked away in her purse, each of them a little lie that pooled like dust on the windowsill. Her sister had painted a portrait of herself that didn't match reality, a sweet, submissive young woman, eager to take care of a house and raise children in the countryside. Margaret knew that she herself was different from those dreams on paper. Thomas returned with a simple tray, 2 porcelain cups that looked like they had been family heirlooms, and a teapot that exuded the comforting aroma of herbs picked from the garden itself. He poured the tea with the same patience he had shown in helping her out of the cart, as if every gesture were important, deserving of full attention. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of stillness that exists between people who recognize something familiar in each other, even though they are strangers. Margaret watched Thomas's hands as he held his cup. Hands that knew hard work, scarred by small scars from years of tending to the earth and animals, but that held the delicate china with surprising gentleness. Through the window, the sun began its slow descent toward the mountains, painting the sky with golden hues that reflected in the wheat fields. Margaret noticed how Thomas watched his estate with the silent pride of someone who had built something lasting with his own hands. It wasn't ostentation, it was the deep satisfaction of a man who had found his place in the world. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice carried the soft accent of the men of the West, tempered by years of conversations, mostly with horses and the wind. He mentioned the challenges of the last drought, the joy of the recent harvest, the plans to expand the orchard next spring. His words painted a picture of a life that had room for a mate, but that didn't desperately depend on one for meaning. Margaret found herself answering honestly about her own experience caring for her sick mother, about the sleepless nights learning to manage the family finances when her father was gone, about the strange satisfaction she found in solving practical problems that others considered a man's job. She wasn't reciting the sweet answers Elizabeth had rehearsed. She was revealing bits and pieces of her true personality. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret noticed that Thomas was watching her with increasing attention. It was not the look of a man trying to fit reality into the fantasy he had created through letters. It was someone's genuine interest discovering a fascinating person sitting at their desk, sipping tea at their home, sharing real stories instead of manufactured dreams. The guilt Margaret had carried since she had climbed into the wagon began to mingle with something more dangerous: hope. Thomas didn't seem disappointed in the woman he had found. If anything, he seemed more interested in the real Margaret than he could ever have been in the imaginary Elizabeth of the letters. When the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Thomas stood up and lit a kerosene lamp. The soft light danced over her face, revealing a thoughtful expression that Margaret couldn't fully decipher. He had prepared the guest room for her, explained gently, understanding that some things needed time to develop naturally. Margaret climbed the wooden stairs that creaked gently beneath her feet, carrying the suitcase that contained Elizabeth's clothes and the secrets she had not yet found the courage to reveal. The room was small but cozy, with a window that offered views of the fields bathed in moonlight and a bed covered with a blanket that smelled of lavender and cared for. She sat on the edge of the bed and took the letters out of her bag. In the dim light of the moon, streaming in through the window, Elizabeth's words seemed to belong to another life, to a story that should never have begun. Margaret knew that the next day she would have to find a way to tell Thomas the truth, but for this night she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to build a real life in this place, alongside a man who seemed to value authenticity more than perfection. Dawn came with the crowing of roosters and the aroma of fresh coffee that rose up the floorboards. Margaret awoke with the strange feeling of being exactly where she should be, even though she knew that her presence there had been born of a lie. Through the window, she watched Thomas walking toward the barn, his steps steadfast on the earth still damp from morning dew. She went downstairs and found the kitchen organized with the precision of someone who had spent years taking care of himself. A clean cup awaited her by the stove, and a note written in careful handwriting explained that Thomas had left early to check on cattle in the northern pasture, but would return before noon. The kindness of the gesture touched Margaret in a way she didn't expect. The coffee was strong and hot, just as she liked it, and Margaret wondered if Thomas had guessed her preference, or if it was simply the way a countryman had learned to brew the drink, without unnecessary delicacy, but with the care of one who values life's small pleasures. She explored the property with the curiosity of someone who was trying to understand the man through the place he had created. The garden behind the house revealed well-kept beds where tomatoes, beans, and herbs grew. There was a natural order in the arrangement of the plants, as if Thomas instinctively understood what each one needed to thrive. The horses approached the fence as Margaret walked to the corral. A chestnut mare with white spots on its snout extended its neck, seeking affection, and Margaret found that her hands automatically reminded her of the gestures she had learned on her grandfather's farm, years before the family moved to town. She stroked the animal's soft neck and felt a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. Thomas found her there when he returned, and Margaret saw something light up in her eyes as she watched her interact naturally with the horses. He didn't say anything about how easily she moved among the animals, but his expression spoke of a deep acknowledgement, as if a puzzle piece had just fit perfectly. Over lunch, Thomas told stories about the region, about the harsh winters that tested the endurance of men and animals, about the springs that rewarded those who persevered with green fields and renewed promises. Margaret listened with genuine attention, asking questions that revealed her understanding of the challenges of rural life. The afternoon brought a sudden storm that turned the sky into a tapestry of grey and purple. The rain drummed on the metal roof with increasing intensity, and Margaret watched Thomas check the windows and doors with the automatic care of someone who had learned to respect the force of nature. He offered a shawl that had belonged to his mother, and when Margaret wrapped it around her shoulders, she felt the comforting weight of a family story. Sitting on the covered porch, sheltered from the rain but still connected to the storm, they watched as the water transformed the dusty landscape into something new and promising. Margaret noticed that Thomas was studying her discreetly, as if he were trying to solve a pleasant mystery. It was then that he mentioned the letters, not with suspicion or accusation, but with the gentle remark that the woman sitting next to him looked different from the person who had revealed herself through the correspondence. There was more substance to Margaret, more depth and strength than the letters had suggested. He didn't sound disappointed. He sounded intrigued and perhaps even more interested. Margaret felt her heart race. It was the moment he had feared and at the same time waited for. The rain created a curtain of intimacy around the porch, and Thomas waited patiently for an answer, his eyes gentle but attentive. She started slowly, choosing her words with the same care he showed when tending to his plants. He talked about Elizabeth, about the escape at dawn, about the impulsive decision to take his sister's place. Her words came out like rain, first hesitantly, then in torrents of honesty she could no longer contain. Thomas listened without interruption, his face reflecting a series of emotions that Margaret could not fully interpret. When she finished, the silence stretched between them like a bridge that they both had to decide if they would cross. The storm was beginning to pass, and rays of golden sunshine pierced the dispersing clouds. Thomas leaned forward slightly in his chair, and Margaret saw something in his eyes that completely surprised her. It was not betrayal or deception. It was relief. He had felt, he explained in his calm voice, that there was something different in Elizabeth's last letters. The tone had changed, becoming deeper and more reflective. Questions about life on the farm had become more practical and less romantic. He had begun to suspect that the woman behind the words was evolving, becoming someone more interesting than he had initially imagined. Margaret realized that her deception had, ironically, revealed her true personality. The letters she thought she was forging had, in fact, shown Thomas exactly who she was. The forced honesty of his confession had completed a portrait he was already learning to admire. The days following Margaret's confession flowed like a river, finding its natural course after a flood. Thomas had not asked her to leave, nor had he talked about finding Elizabeth or undoing the original agreement. Instead, he had suggested that they use the time to truly get to know each other, without the weight of expectations created by letters that had never reflected reality. Margaret discovered that life with Thomas had its own rhythm, dictated by the needs of animals and the cycles of the earth. She would wake up to the first rays of sunshine and find Thomas already tending to the horses, his efficient movements shaped by years of solitary routine. Gradually, she began to join him in these morning tasks, and Thomas accepted her help with the quiet gratitude of one who recognized genuine competence. Margaret's hands, which had become soft during the years of caring for her mother in the city, began to develop new calluses. She learned how to milk the cows under Thomas's patient guidance, figured out the right rhythm to spread hay, and developed a natural instinct to sense when animals needed special attention. Each new skill connected her more deeply with the land and with the man who had made this place his life. Thomas watched these transformations with a growing admiration that he did not try to hide. Margaret was not the delicate, dependent young woman that Elizabeth had promised to be in her letters. She was a strong woman, able to face challenges and find practical solutions to real problems. When one of the mares developed a wound on her paw, Margaret didn't back down in female horror. She held on to the rope while Thomas cleaned the wound, his hands steady and his presence comforting to both the animal and the farmer. The afternoons brought a different intimacy. They worked side by side in the garden, Margaret learning the secrets Thomas had discovered about the local soil and climate. Their conversations flowed naturally between practical topics and deeper reflections on the life, dreams, and choices that had brought them to that moment. Margaret discovered that Thomas possessed a natural intelligence that extended far beyond agricultural knowledge. He read voraciously during the long winters, and his small library revealed varied interests, from treatises on cattle breeding to volumes of poetry that he discreetly quoted when something in nature piqued his admiration. There was a depth to it that Elizabeth's original letters would never have been able to appreciate. One evening, while stargazing from the balcony, Thomas shared the story of how he had acquired the property. He had worked as a cowboy for years, saving every penny until he could buy this abandoned land. He had restored the house alone, built the corrals with his own hands, planted each tree in the orchard with the patience of someone who builds a future one seed at a time. Margaret realized she was listening to the biography of a man who had turned dreams into reality through persistent work and quiet determination. There was no drama or grand heroic gestures in his story, just the deep dignity of someone who had chosen to build something lasting rather than simply exist. She, for her part, talked about her years caring for her mother, about how she had learned to manage the family's finances when her father passed away, about the nights she had studied accounting books to make sure they didn't lose their home. Their experiences had been different from Thomas's, but both had learned that life rewards those who take responsibility rather than waiting for others to solve their problems. It was during one of these nightly conversations that Margaret realized that something fundamental had changed between them. It was no longer the careful courtesy between strangers trying to decide if they could build a future together. It was the mutual recognition of two people who had found in themselves a deeper compatibility than any correspondence marriage arrangement could have provided. Thomas began to make plans that included Margaret naturally. He talked about expanding the garden next spring, about buying some sheep to diversify the property, about building a new stable that would be big enough to house the foals they expected from mares next year. Her dreams had found room for Margaret's talents and interests, and she found that she could clearly visualize her participation in each project. The turning point came during an especially beautiful morning when Margaret was preparing preserves with the tomatoes in the garden. Thomas entered the kitchen carrying a simple bouquet of wildflowers he had gathered from the fields. These weren't elaborate roses or fancy arrangements. They were daisies, poppies, and other flowers that grew naturally on the land they shared. When he offered the flowers, Margaret saw in Thomas's eyes a silent question that went far beyond courtesy or gratitude. It was a request for her to consider making this house her real home, this man her true companion, this life her real life. The flowers trembled slightly in his hands, revealing a vulnerability he rarely allowed others to see. Margaret held the wildflowers in her hands and felt the weight of all the decisions that had brought her to this moment. The sweet aroma of the daisies mixed with the smell of ripe tomatoes and fresh bread that baked in the oven, creating a symphony of aromas that spoke of home, of belonging, of a life built with care and genuine love. She looked up to meet Thomas's gaze and saw infinite patience there. He wasn't pushing for an immediate response. He wasn't demanding promises she might not have been ready to make. It was the same kindness he showed to his most nervous horses, offering a constant and reliable presence, hoping that confidence would naturally grow. In the weeks that followed, Margaret allowed herself to fully imagine what it would be like to call this place home forever. She mentally redesigned the kitchen, visualizing where she would hang the dried herbs she would pick in her own garden. He imagined winter mornings when he would wake up next to Thomas, hearing the wind howl in the windows as they planned the improvements they would make to the property when spring came. Thomas seemed to intuitively understand that Margaret needed time for her decision to spring up naturally, like the seeds he planted so patiently. He continued to include her in his future plans, but without pressure, allowing her to feel how her own ideas and dreams found space in the life they could build together. Autumn arrived by painting the leaves of the oak trees with golden and red hues that mirrored the sunset over the distant mountains. Margaret and Thomas worked side by side, preparing the estate for the winter, and she found deep satisfaction in each task completed. It wasn't just work. It was investment in a future that she was beginning to see clearly. One afternoon, while they were organizing the pantry with the preserves they had prepared together, Margaret realized that she no longer thought of herself as a visitor or an imposter. He knew every creaking plank on the floor, every spot of sunlight that moved across the walls during the day, every sound the horses made when something disturbed them during the night. The house had become familiar in a way that transcended time or formal agreements. Thomas found Margaret that afternoon, standing on the porch, watching the fields where the wheat had been harvested and the land was being prepared for the next season's planting. She held a letter she had written to Elizabeth, finally explaining her decision and asking forgiveness for taking her place, but also thanking her for making this unlikely encounter with happiness possible. As Thomas approached, Margaret turned to him with a smile that carried all the certainty that had slowly grown in her heart during those months. She didn't need elaborate words or dramatic promises. She simply reached out and intertwined her fingers with his, feeling the calm strength she had learned to associate with all that was true and reliable in her new life. Thomas understood the meaning of that simple gesture. It was the answer he had waited for, with the patience of someone who knows the value of things that grow slowly. Margaret had chosen not only to stay, but to build a real life in this place, next to him. The wedding took place the following spring, in a simple ceremony at the church in Cedar Valley, with only a few neighbors as witnesses. Margaret wore a dress she had sewn from fabric purchased in the nearest town. Not the light blue Elizabeth had chosen, but a shade of deep green that complemented her eyes and reflected her authentic personality. When the Reverend asked if she would take Thomas Bennet for her husband, Margaret answered in a clear voice that carried all the certainty she had found in this barren land, in this gentleman, in this life that had begun with a lie but had blossomed into the purest truth. The years that followed brought their own seasons of challenges and joys. Margaret learned that true love was not the romantic feeling of the stories she had read, but something deeper and more resilient, the daily choice to build a life together, to face difficulties side by side, to find beauty in the simple moments of companionship. Elizabeth eventually wrote back, telling of her new life in the big city where she had found the kind of adventure she had always sought. His letter carried genuine joy at Margaret's happiness, and also relief at having escaped a life that would never have suited her restless nature. Thomas and Margaret built the stable they had planned, expanded the orchard, and watched their horses breed, filling the estate with energetic foals that hopped across the fields as promises of continuity. The house echoed with laughter during the evenings when they received neighbors, and with quiet conversations when it was just the two of them, planning the future or simply enjoying the present. Margaret never regretted the impulsive decision that had brought her to Cedar Valley. She had taken Elizabeth's place not only in the wagon that had brought her to the west, but in the whole life that her sister had rejected. And he had discovered that sometimes the best destinations are those we find when we are brave enough to follow the heart, even when it leads us down unexpected paths. True love, Margaret concluded on a golden afternoon, as she watched Thomas work in the fields, chooses no face or name. He recognizes the soul he has always sought, even when it arrives in disguise, even when it is born of improbable circumstances, even when it flourishes in the driest soil of the American West. If you like this story of love and courage in the Wild West, please leave your like to support our work. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our gripping narratives about the most fascinating period in American history.